I had rented a small lake house up north for a week, wanting to get away from everything. It was early September, the end of summer, and most of the nearby cabins were already closed for the season. The place I found sat right by the water, an old single-story wooden house with faded white paint and a wraparound porch. There was a narrow dock stretching out into the still lake, and thick woods surrounding the back. The air smelled damp and earthy, the way it does when leaves are starting to rot and the mornings are colder than the days before. The first day felt calm. The silence was heavier than I expected. No traffic, no voices, just the occasional ripple of the lake or a bird somewhere far off. Inside, everything had that dry, wooden scent old cabins carry. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, and there was dust in every corner. I unpacked my few things, made a quick meal, and sat on the porch for a while as the light faded. The lake turned silver in the moonlight. I remember feeling almost hypnotized by the stillness of it. That night, I barely slept. The wind picked up and kept pushing against the house, making the walls groan. I heard something banging lightly outside, probably a loose piece of siding or a hanging tool, but it kept me awake. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard faint footsteps on the wooden deck, but I told myself it was just branches or animals. The sound stopped after a minute, but the silence afterward made me realize how alone I really was. The next morning, I noticed something strange near the dock. There were wet footprints leading up from the water, faint but clear on the wooden boards. Bare feet smaller than mine. They trailed halfway up the dock and stopped abruptly. I crouched down and touched one. The wood was still damp. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a raccoon or some animal had been there during the night. I brushed it off, but it stayed in my mind. Later that afternoon, I decided to go for a swim. The water was cold and murky, and I couldn't see more than a foot beneath the surface. Every movement I made caused ripples that echoed around the quiet lake. There were no other swimmers, no boats, no sounds except the soft splash of water against my ears. I didn't stay long. I got out and sat on the edge of the dock, drying off in the weak sun. That's when I noticed something else. A rope tied loosely around one of the dock posts. It was frayed, old, and half submerged in the water. I hadn't seen it before. When I pulled on it, it felt like it was tied to something heavy beneath the surface. I tugged a few times, but it didn't move. That night, the banging came back, louder this time. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the porch. Nothing was there. The beam of light swept across the yard, hitting the trees, the lake, and the dock. Everything looked still except for the rope. It was moving, slowly tightening and loosening, as if something beneath the water was pulling on it. I stood there for a while, staring, trying to decide if it was the current or an animal. Then the light flickered out. I went back inside, locked the doors, and sat awake until dawn. When I finally stepped outside again, the rope was gone. Only the end of it remained, frayed and hanging off the dock. I felt uneasy all day. I kept checking the windows, scanning the woods behind the house, trying to tell myself there was nothing wrong. Around noon, I took a walk around the lake. There were a few other old houses scattered around, but all looked empty. Boards on some windows, no cars, no signs of people. The path around the water was muddy, lined with reeds and the smell of algae. I noticed a small clearing on the far side where someone had left a fire pit and a few broken bottles. The ashes were cold, but not old. That night was colder than before. The sound of insects faded earlier than usual, and the wind stopped completely. Around midnight, I heard a splash. Not small like a fish, it was deep, heavy, like something large dropped into the water. Then silence. I sat there in the dark, trying not to breathe too loudly. After a few minutes, I heard it again. A wet, dragging sound, faint but distinct, moving along the edge of the dock. I stayed still, every muscle tight, waiting for it to stop. When morning came, I walked down to the dock again. There were marks on the boards, dark smears leading from the water to the start of the dock. Mud and algae. Something had climbed up there. I scanned the surface of the lake, but it was calm again, almost too calm. I wanted to leave that day, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I had paid for the week and had nowhere else to go. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping the blinds closed. The air inside felt heavier now, thicker somehow. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about that rope, about the footprints, about the dragging sound. I tried to tell myself I might have just been hearing things, that isolation can make your mind twist things. But that night, the noise came again. It wasn't from the dock this time. It was from under the house. It started as a faint scraping sound, like wood being dragged against the floorboards. Then it grew louder. I could hear it moving slowly beneath me, shifting from one end of the living room to the other. I froze, listening. There was no crawl space entrance that I knew of, no basement, just the wooden foundation sitting over damp earth. I wanted to run out of the house, but I was afraid of what I might see outside. After maybe 10 minutes, the sound stopped. I stayed awake until morning again. When the light finally came through the windows, I walked around the back of the house, down toward the foundation. The dirt was soft from rain. I crouched and looked beneath. The space was narrow, barely high enough for a person to crawl through. The earth was disturbed, patches of it freshly dug, still wet. I saw a scrap of fabric half buried in the mud. It looked like part of a shirt, soaked and stuck to the dirt. That was when I decided to leave. I packed everything fast and didn't even eat breakfast. When I started loading my car, I realized how quiet it was again. No wind, no birds, no sound from the lake. I turned to look one last time, and that's when I saw it. Out near the dock, something pale was floating just below the surface. For a moment, I thought it was a log, but then I saw the shape of an arm. It wasn't moving, just drifting slowly back and forth with the current. The water was shallow enough that I could see a dark mass beneath it, hair, maybe. I didn't go closer. I backed away, got into the car, and drove off. The drive back felt endless. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept thinking about that rope and how it had been tied to something heavy underwater. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I finally got signal, I called the rental company and told them there was something in the lake, that someone needed to check. The woman on the phone said they'd send someone out, but she sounded distant, like she'd heard it before. A week later, I got a message from an unknown number, just a short text saying, "The authorities found nothing." That was it. No name, no details. I didn't reply, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see the lake in my mind. The still water, the rope, the pale shape drifting just below the surface. And I think about the noises under the house, the soft scraping, the freshly dug soil. Whatever was in that water, whatever had been crawling beneath that house, it wasn't supposed to be there. And maybe it still isn't gone. I rented a small lake house in early October, far from any town, deep in the woods of northern Michigan. I had been working nonstop for months and wanted a break. A quiet week alone to clear my head. The photos online made it look peaceful. A weathered wooden house sitting by a still lake, a long dock stretching into the dark water, and trees crowding around the edges like a green wall. The listing mentioned no neighbors within a mile, and that was what I wanted most. Silence. The road leading there was nothing more than packed dirt and gravel. It wound through the trees for what felt like forever, until it finally opened up to a clearing. The lake looked gray and flat, like glass reflecting the overcast sky. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. The house itself looked older than in the photos. Paint peeling off the siding, the porch steps uneven, the windows slightly fogged. It didn't bother me at first, it gave it character. Inside, the place was simple. 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room facing the lake. The air was cold, carrying that stale wooden scent of a place that's been closed too long. There was an old space heater in the corner and a stack of firewood outside. I unpacked my things, set some food in the fridge, and walked down to the dock. The boards creaked under my weight. I stared out at the water. It was calm, but so dark it looked almost black. That first night was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the house settling. The nearest town was about 40 minutes away, and my phone had no signal. I liked that at first. It made me feel disconnected from everything. I made a small fire in the fireplace, listened to the crackle, and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every small sound seemed sharper out there. The faint tap of branches against the siding, the groan of the dock in the wind. I told myself it was just part of being alone. The next morning, I went for a walk around the lake. There was a narrow dirt path that followed the shoreline. Halfway around, I noticed another dock across the water, broken and sinking into the shallows, connected to a small clearing with what looked like the remains of an old cabin. The roof had collapsed, and vines had swallowed the walls. I figured it must have been abandoned for years. The silence there was heavier than the rest of the area. Even the birds seemed to avoid it. When I got back, I noticed footprints near my dock. Bare footprints, small, maybe a child's. The mud was fresh. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it. The closest neighbor was miles away. I hadn't seen a single car since I got there. I knelt down, touched one of the prints. They were still damp. I tried to laugh it off, told myself maybe it was an animal, but they were shaped too perfectly like human feet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft noises outside. Something moving in the water, splashing gently like someone waiting near the shore. I turned off the lights and looked through the window, but all I saw was blackness. The moonlight was faint, barely enough to see the edge of the dock. The sound continued for another minute, then stopped completely. I sat in bed staring at the ceiling for hours after that. The next day, the air felt heavier, colder. The lake was covered in mist that didn't lift until almost noon. When it finally cleared, I saw something floating near the far end of the dock. A small object bobbing in the water. I grabbed a long branch and pulled it closer. It was a shoe, a small, muddy sneaker. It looked like it had been there a while, but not long enough to rot. I threw it back into the water and went inside. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I tried to distract myself by cleaning and making a fire, but the unease wouldn't go away. The idea of someone being out there, watching maybe, started to crawl under my skin. I checked every window before it got dark, pulled the curtains shut, and locked the doors. The lake was silent that night, but the woods weren't. Around midnight, I heard twigs snapping behind the house. Then the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Slow, deliberate steps that came close, then stopped. I didn't move. I just sat in the dark, every sense sharpened, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After a while, the sound faded. I waited another hour before I dared to move. When I finally looked outside again, the yard was empty. But the next morning, I found something on the porch. A small pile of wet leaves and dirt, shaped almost like a footprint, pressed into the wood. That was when I started to think about leaving. But it was late in the season, and my car had nearly gotten stuck in the mud on the way in. The forecast showed rain coming, so I figured I'd wait until morning and leave early. That evening, as the light started to fade, I sat at the table staring out through the window toward the dock. Something caught my eye near the waterline. It looked like a dark figure crouched low, half hidden behind the tall reeds. It didn't move for several seconds, then slowly sank out of view. I backed away from the window, my stomach twisting. I barely slept that night. I kept hearing faint splashing again, closer than before, and then something tapping on the side of the house, almost rhythmic. The sound of fingernails against wood. I wanted to believe it was branches in the wind, but the air outside was still. When morning came, I grabbed my bag and went to load the car. The ground was wet from a light rain. The first thing I saw was the back door. It was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. Inside, the floor near the door was muddy, a trail of wet footprints leading toward the kitchen, then stopping near the sink. I followed them with my eyes. There, beside the counter, was another small pile of leaves and dirt, like the one from the porch. My throat tightened. I didn't go any further. I turned around, grabbed my keys, and left everything behind. The road out was slippery, covered in wet leaves, but I didn't care. I just kept driving, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. When I finally got to the highway, I pulled over and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking. I felt a strange mix of fear and disbelief. I told myself maybe it was a squatter or some local kid playing a prank, but that didn't explain the quiet steps, the way the noises only came when I was still, the way the door had been opened from the inside. 2 days later, I got a call from the rental office asking about the house keys. I told them I left in a hurry and they could keep the deposit. A few weeks passed before I could sleep normally again, but curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the lake online, trying to find any mention of it. I found an old article buried deep in local records. Something about a drowning 15 years ago. A boy had gone missing from a nearby property, never found. The search was called off after 2 weeks. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, and I'm not saying it was connected. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that slow splash of water, that faint dragging sound near the dock. I think about those footprints, the shoe, the open door. Someone had been out there with me. Someone still lives around that lake. And I'm sure that if I had stayed one more night, I would have found out who it was. Probably in the worst way possible. I rented a lake house last summer, far out in the countryside, surrounded by pine trees and silence. I needed to get away for a while, away from people, noise, and city life. I found this place online. The photos showed a quiet house right on the edge of a large, calm lake. There were no other houses in sight, just water and woods. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, but that's what I wanted. The drive there was long and empty. The last 30 minutes were nothing but dirt road through thick forest. My car rattled the whole way. When I finally reached the clearing, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No wind, no traffic, no birds, just still air. The lake stretched out in front of me, smooth like glass, reflecting the dull blue sky. The house was small and old, with weathered gray wood and a narrow porch that looked like it had been there for decades. Inside, everything smelled like dust and damp wood. The furniture was basic: a couch, a table, an old bed, and a few shelves. The floors creaked with every step. I opened all the windows to let in air, but it didn't help much. I unpacked, put my cooler in the fridge, and went outside to the dock. The boards were soft and uneven under my shoes. When I stood at the edge and looked down, the water was dark, almost black. I could see my reflection, but nothing beneath it. The first night was quiet. The air cooled fast after sunset. I sat by the lake, watching fireflies hover over the reeds. The only sound was the soft clicking of insects. When I finally went inside, the darkness felt heavy. Every sound stood out: the groan of the old floorboards, the hum of the fridge, the faint movement of the house in the wind. I lay in bed listening to it until I fell asleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. The moonlight came through the thin curtains, lighting up the room just enough to see shapes. At first, I didn't know why I woke up, but then I heard something. A soft splash outside, followed by a faint creak of wood. I froze. It sounded like someone stepping onto the dock. I told myself it was probably a fish or an animal, but then the sound came again. Slow steps, boards groaning one by one. The lake was maybe 20 feet from the window, and I could hear it clearly. The steps went halfway down the dock, then stopped. After a minute of silence, I heard another splash, like something slipping back into the water. Then nothing. In the morning, I went to check. The boards near the end of the dock were wet, and there were faint marks. Footprints, bare and small, like someone had walked out there with wet feet. The prints ended at the water's edge. I crouched down and looked closer. The mud between the boards was disturbed too, as if something heavy had pressed against it. It didn't make sense. The nearest house was miles away. I stayed out there for a while, staring at the water, but it was still and calm. The second night, I locked all the doors and windows before it got dark. The air felt colder. I sat at the table for a while, writing in a notebook, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. Around midnight, I heard it again, the faint splash, then the creak of the dock. This time I got up quietly and looked out through the window. The moonlight hit the water in patches, silver and black. At the far end of the dock, I saw movement. Something was in the water right at the edge. I couldn't see details, just a pale shape floating close to the surface. It moved slowly, then slipped under. The water rippled once and went still. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Around 3, I heard something brush against the side of the house. A scraping sound like wet fabric or skin against wood. It moved along the wall, stopped under the window, then faded away. When morning finally came, I went outside to check. The ground beneath the window was wet, even though it hadn't rained. There were drag marks in the dirt, leading from the lake to the wall and then back again. The next day, I walked around the property. There was a narrow trail through the woods that circled part of the lake. I followed it, trying to shake off the unease. The further I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of water moving. About halfway around, I found another dock, old, half-collapsed, attached to what was left of a cabin. The roof had caved in, and weeds grew through the broken boards. I looked around and saw something near the shore, a rusted metal bucket, and beside it, what looked like torn fabric, tangled in the reeds. When I pulled it free, it was part of a jacket, dark blue and water-stained. I went back to the house before sunset. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there before me, someone who never left. That night, I made sure every light was off, every door locked. I sat by the window for hours, staring at the lake. Around 1 a.m., I saw ripples again, slow and wide, spreading out from the middle of the water. Something large was moving just below the surface, heading toward the dock. I could hear the faint lapping of water against the posts. Then came the same soft creak of wood. I didn't move. The sound traveled up the dock, each step slow and careful, like someone testing their weight. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. The night was cold, the air heavy with moisture. I shined the light toward the dock. Nothing. Just the boards, slick and wet, stretching into the black water. I stood there, breathing hard, scanning the surface. The beam caught something small floating near the edge. A glove. A child's glove, waterlogged and pale. I backed away slowly and went inside. I barely slept after that. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something outside. The creak of the dock, the faint splash of water. When morning came, I decided to leave. I packed my things as fast as I could. As I carried the last box to the car, I noticed something near the steps. It was another footprint, bare, small, pressed into the wet dirt, leading away from the porch toward the trees. As I was loading up, I glanced toward the lake one last time. The water looked calm again, the surface shining softly under the early sun. But then I saw movement, something barely visible, a ripple starting near the far end of the dock, moving outward in a slow circle. The same kind of ripple that happens when something rises just under the surface. I stood there watching until it faded away. Then I got in the car and drove off. When I reached the main road, I finally got a phone signal and stopped to check my messages. I searched the lake's name online, out of curiosity more than anything. Buried in an old local article, I found something that made my stomach turn. About 10 years ago, a family had rented a cabin on that same lake. Their youngest son went missing while playing near the dock. The search went on for days, but they never found him. The family moved away not long after. I don't believe in supernatural things, and I still don't. But there's something about that lake, something wrong beneath it. I can't stop thinking about those small footprints, the wet marks on the porch, the glove floating in the water. Someone was out there, close enough to leave prints, close enough to touch the house. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I hear that same creak of wood in my head, the sound of slow steps on a dock that leads into dark, cold water. And I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night. I think I would have gone outside again, maybe a little closer this time, just to see what was there. And maybe I wouldn't have come back. I spent one summer alone at a lake house that belonged to a friend of my uncle's. He offered it to me after I lost my job, saying it would be good to clear my head. I didn't argue. I wanted somewhere quiet, away from people, away from noise. The house sat deep in the woods, right on the edge of a long, still lake. The nearest town was almost an hour away, and the road that led there was mostly dirt and gravel, barely used. When I arrived, the air smelled like wet pine and algae. The place looked smaller than I expected. A single-story wooden cabin with chipped white paint, a tin roof, and a narrow dock stretching into the lake. The dock boards were gray and soft from years of weather. The lake itself was calm and dark, its surface so still it looked like glass. The woods wrapped tight around the house, thick enough that sunlight barely touched the ground. Inside, the air was musty, smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was plain, a couch that sagged in the middle, a small table, and a couple of chairs. The floorboards groaned every time I moved. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and the only light came from a few weak lamps that buzzed when turned on. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. The first couple of days were fine. I'd wake up early, drink coffee on the porch, and watch the mist drift across the lake. Sometimes I'd hear small splashes far out on the water, probably fish or beavers. I read books, took short hikes, and tried not to think about my life back home. The silence was strange at first, but almost comforting. I thought I could get used to it. On the third night, something changed. I woke up around midnight for no reason, just wide awake in the dark. The moonlight spilled through the window, faint and gray. The lake was silent. Then I heard it. A soft sound, like wood creaking under pressure, came from outside, from the direction of the dock. It was slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully on the boards. Then a splash, quiet but heavy, followed by silence. I lay there, listening, my heart beat loud in my ears. After a minute, I convinced myself it was an animal and tried to go back to sleep, but I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, curiosity got the better of me. I walked down to the dock. The boards were damp with dew, but at the far end, the wood looked darker, wetter. I noticed faint prints, bare footprints, leading from the water onto the dock. They were small, maybe from a kid or a thin adult. I crouched and touched one. It was still damp. I looked around, scanning the trees and the shoreline. Nothing. The woods were still. I stood there for a while, uneasy but trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been swimming late at night. Maybe a neighbor I didn't know about. I told myself that and went back inside. That day I tried to relax. I fished for a few hours, read, and cooked dinner early. When the sun started to set, the temperature dropped fast. The lake turned dark, the water almost black, reflecting a dull orange sky. By nightfall, everything was silent again. I kept the porch light on longer than usual and locked the doors. Around 2 a.m., I woke again. This time it wasn't footsteps I heard. It was the sound of water moving. Not the small ripples from fish, but slow, steady waves hitting the shore, like something large was shifting beneath the surface. It lasted a few minutes, then faded away. When I looked out the window, I could see the dock moving slightly, swaying as if something heavy had brushed against it. I stood there in the dark, watching, not daring to move. The next morning, I went out again, telling myself I'd find a logical reason. Maybe a log or a large animal had floated close to the dock. But when I got there, the footprints were back. This time, there were more wet, bare prints leading from the water all the way up to the porch steps. The mud around the house had been disturbed too, as if someone had walked around during the night. My stomach sank. I checked all the doors and windows again. They were still locked from the inside. That evening, I decided to stay up. I turned off all the lights, sat near the window with a small flashlight, and waited. The night air was thick and cool. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again, the soft creaking of the dock. I pointed the flashlight toward it, but the distance was too far. The light barely reached halfway down. The noise stopped. I waited. Then came another sound, closer this time, like wet feet slapping against wood. I could hear the boards flexing one by one, moving toward the shore. Then silence again. I turned the flashlight off and just listened. After maybe a minute, I heard a new sound. A faint rustling near the side of the house, slow and dragging. My whole body tensed. The sound moved along the wall, then stopped near the back door. I sat frozen, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, there was a single soft tap on the door. Just one. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sun came up, I walked around the house. The ground near the back door was covered in damp mud. There were more footprints, smaller this time, and what looked like a trail leading back to the water. I followed it down to the lake, my stomach turning. Near the shore, The sand was disturbed, like something had been dragged or crawled there. The trail disappeared under the water. I wanted to leave that day, but the dirt road had turned to thick mud from last night's rain. My car's tires would have sunk before I got a mile. I decided to wait it out one more night. I tried to distract myself, stayed busy, but by sundown my nerves were shot. I locked the doors again and left a light on in every room. That night, it started earlier. The first sound came before midnight, a heavy splash, followed by slow movement in the water. I turned off the lights and stood by the window, staring toward the dock. The air felt thicker than before, harder to breathe. Then, through the thin moonlight, I saw something, movement near the dock's end. A shape, human-sized, crouched low. It stood still for several seconds, then slipped into the water without a sound. I felt my whole body go cold. I didn't move until morning. When the first light hit the lake, I packed my things and loaded the car, not caring about the road. I drove slow at first, the tires slipping in the mud, but I kept going until I reached pavement. When I finally got back to town, I stopped at a gas station and just sat there for half an hour, shaking. A few days later, I called my uncle and told him I was done with the place. He didn't ask questions, just said he'd tell his friend. Out of curiosity, I looked up the property online. Buried in old records, I found a short article from 15 years ago. A man had gone missing there while fishing alone. They found his boat drifting, but never found him. His family had sold the place after that. I don't know what I saw. I keep telling myself it was someone living out there, maybe a squatter or a runaway. That's the only thing that makes sense. But I can't forget the sound of those wet footprints outside my door, or the sight of that dark shape slipping under the water like it belonged there. Now, whenever I see a still lake, I think about that one. How calm it looked during the day, how quiet it was at night, and how something or someone kept coming out of it, again and again, just to see if I was still there. If I hadn't left that morning, I think I would have found out why. I spent one autumn alone at a small lake house deep in the northern woods. It wasn't mine. It belonged to a man my father knew, an old coworker who used it for fishing trips but hadn't been up there in years. He said I could stay as long as I wanted, no charge, as long as I kept the place clean and didn't break anything. I took the offer because I needed time away from everything. My head wasn't in a good place, and the thought of quiet water and no people sounded perfect. It took nearly 6 hours to get there. The last stretch of road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to mud. My car struggled up the narrow path through the trees until the woods finally opened into a small clearing. The lake lay still, dark as oil, surrounded by thick pines. The air was sharp and cold, smelling like wet bark and earth. The house sat a few yards from the water, leaning slightly to one side. It looked older than I expected. Gray siding, a tin roof spotted with rust, and a porch that sagged in the middle. When I stepped inside, it felt like walking into someone's forgotten life. There were dishes in the cabinets, blankets folded neatly on the couch, old photographs on the shelves, black and white ones of men holding up fish, smiling. Dust covered everything. The smell was a mix of damp wood, old paper, and mold. The first thing I did was open all the windows. The lake breeze crept in, cold and clean. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, made a small fire in the stove, and sat outside on the porch until the sun went down. The water was so still it looked frozen, reflecting the trees perfectly. There were no other houses in sight. No sound of traffic, no lights across the lake. When night came, it was the kind of dark that swallows everything. I could hear every small sound, the wind brushing the branches, the slow creak of the dock moving on the water. That first night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing noises outside. Not loud ones, just soft, irregular ones. The kind that make you question if they're real. A splash somewhere near the dock, a single crack of wood, the shuffle of something moving near the side of the house. I told myself it was animals. Out there, everything was alive and moving. Still, I locked the door before going to bed. The next morning, I walked down to the dock. The boards were slick with dew. The air was colder, and fog hung low over the water. Near the edge, I noticed muddy prints.
Bare footprints.
Small, maybe from a kid or a woman. They started at the dock and disappeared at the waterline. I stared at them for a long time. They looked fresh. I thought maybe someone had come by while I was sleeping. Maybe a fisherman or a hiker passing through. But there were no tire tracks or boot marks on the dirt road. No sign anyone else had been near. I tried to forget about it. I made breakfast, went for a walk through the trees, and read for most of the afternoon. The silence started to feel heavier though, like the air was pressing down on me. Every sound seemed sharper. The way the house creaked felt different, like it wasn't just from settling wood but from something shifting nearby. That night it rained. The roof made a constant tapping sound, and the wind blew against the windows. I lay in bed listening to the lake. Even over the rain, I could hear the steady rhythm of waves slapping against the dock. Then, around midnight, there was a different sound. A thud, dull, heavy, like something solid hitting the porch. Then a scraping noise, slow and rough, moving along the wooden boards. My chest tightened. I wanted to get up and look, but I couldn't make myself move. The noise went on for almost a minute, then stopped. In the morning, the rain had stopped. I went outside slowly, half expecting to see something waiting there. The porch was wet and covered in leaves, but near the steps, there was a long streak of mud across the boards, like something had been dragged. It led to the edge of the porch and ended there. I looked out at the lake. The water was calm again, perfectly still. I started to feel uneasy about staying there, but leaving meant driving several hours through woods and back roads, and I didn't want to face the city again yet. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a fallen branch or an animal moving during the night. I tried to act normal. I fished a little that day, sat by the water, watched the sun fall behind the trees. By evening, I almost felt calm again. That night, I made sure to check every lock twice. I left one lamp on in the living room. I was sitting on the couch reading when I heard it again, the creak of the dock. It was faint, rhythmic, like footsteps, slow and steady. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I stood up and went to the window. The moonlight was dim, but I could see the outline of the dock stretching into the lake. Something was moving at the far end, just a shadow, but it was there. It was crouched low, barely visible, and it wasn't moving toward or away, just staying still. Then, after a few seconds, it slipped soundlessly into the water. I couldn't stay there after that. I sat awake the rest of the night, staring out the window until the sky turned gray. At dawn, I packed everything I could fit in my bag and carried it to the car. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. When I walked down the steps, I noticed something new, mud smeared along the bottom of the doorframe, and a single wet footprint on the porch, small and bare. I didn't bother locking the door. I started the car and backed out onto the dirt path. The trees closed around me as I drove, their shadows flickering across the windshield. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway hours later. A few weeks passed before I told anyone. I mentioned it to my uncle, but he didn't seem surprised. He said the lake had always been strange, that people avoided it because of how deep it was. Later that night, I looked it up online. There were old articles, stories about a drowning years ago. A boy who went missing while swimming alone. They searched for days but never found him. The family sold the property afterward. I don't know what I heard or saw, but I know it wasn't my imagination. I still remember the sound of those slow, heavy steps on the dock. The quiet splash as something slipped beneath the surface. The footprints that started from the water and led to my porch. I keep telling myself it was just a person, maybe someone living in the woods using the lake to hide. That's what I want to believe. Sometimes, though, when I wake in the middle of the night, I think about that still water, the dark shape crouched at the end of the dock. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night, if I hadn't left when I did. I can almost hear it again, that faint, slow creak of wood under weight, moving closer to the house. And every time it rains, that sound echoes in my head, the dragging on the porch, the soft thud near the steps. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Something or someone was living in that lake. and I left just in time before it decided to come inside.